I'm Todd MacKay. This is the Canadian Taxpayers Podcast. We're dedicated to lower taxes, less waste, more accountable government. We're going to do something different today. Instead of talking about a bunch of different issues that are coming up, we'll get back to that further into the new year. We thought we'd look back at the year that was. 2020 was a crazy time, so I thought I'd interview our CEO and President Scott Hennig and talk about it was a wild ride. How are you doing, Scott?
Yeah. How am I doing? I don't know. That's a good question. I'm doing just fine, I think. I think that's the answer for 2020 is I'm doing fine, all things considering.
Yeah. Like I'm fine for today. We'll see what happens tomorrow. I don't know. It's sort of what it is. So here's the first question. Last year, you were just, finishing up your first year as president. You're coming into your second year this time last year. How are you feeling coming into that last year?
Yeah, I was feeling fantastic. I mean, other than we were like on the verge of World War III. No one remembers this. No one remembers that we were on the verge of World War III like a year ago with like Iran and the planes going down and like Donald Trump. And I thought, seems like it's such old news now that no one even thinks about that we were like on the brink of some sort of other war. But anyways, other than that happening at this time, sort of a year ago, good. Like the organization was doing well. We were, had a lot of victories in 2019. We were marching towards other ones in 2020, some of which we got anyways. But yeah, like I was feeling real good about a year ago.
Okay. Well, let's not skip ahead to when we started not feeling real good there for a while. Let's think about a story. This one I almost forget sometimes too. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle moved to Canada. It was huge news. Everybody was talking about it. And it was an interesting question because there was a lot of debate about whether taxpayers should be paying for their costs, especially security costs. And the politicians couldn't seem to figure out what to say. They were just all kind of looking at their shoes, even the opposition, everybody. What do you remember about our deliberations on that issue?
Yeah, well, I mean, and I get where some of these politicians are coming from because these are very likable people. Like these are not like this isn't someone in the royal family that are a pariah that everyone hates, or even just like some other billionaire, millionaire celebrity coming in and bossing people around in a new country. These are lovely people, right? I mean, like everyone loves Meghan and Harry. They seem like the kind of couple you'd love to hang out and I guess walk your babies together in the park. Like I don't know what you would do with them exactly. Because I don't know if you would want to go to watch a movie or something with. Although she's a Hollywood star, she probably have a lot of really interesting stories. And she had a bit of an affinity for Canada, having shot her television series in Toronto, and I think her mother lived right. Her mother lives here.
So.
That's not correct, something like that. So I mean, it was sort of. I think a lot of people were like, "Hey, that's cool." Like Canada's always the sort of second fiddle to other sort of countries like the US and even somewhat to the UK, where when someone pays attention to us, Canadians get excited. Like, oh, we're being talked about. I think that actually was a big reason why a lot of people were very excited when Trudeau got elected as prime minister, was that he was on the cover of GQ. Well, Stephen Harper was never on the cover of GQ. Like, we're all of a sudden the sexy nation that people are talking about with the this cool young prime minister. And I think that was sort of a similar thing with Harry and Meghan. Oh, we're the cool country that, these royalty want to live in. Like, oh, that's awesome. But then we found out that we were paying the bill. And, but that's the other thing about Canadians is that we don't love the royals so much that we want to pay all their bills. It's like we like them. It's not like the UK, or it's not like Australia or New Zealand where they often will have like discussions about whether they should get rid of the monarchy. It's not really a conversation that often in Canada. Like that's not a regular thing for debate. But when you ask us to pay bills for the monarchy, then it's like, hey, like we're happy to have you on our money, happy to have you come over whenever we have a big birthday or something, but we ain't paying your bills. And so I think that when we, that deliberation that we had about like, how hard do we poke this bear? I think when we focused in on the money, it made it a lot easier because, and really that's what it was for us from the start. Like it was never about like, let's stick it to these, posh royals. It was, come on, should we really have to pay your bill? And that was sort of the tone we took as an organization. And it certainly resonated. There's no question it resonated.
Oh, it resonated huge. We got more than 100,000 petition signatures. Ultimately, the government said, no, we're not paying for the bills after having paid a bunch of the bills. We're still digging that stuff up. I think one of my favorite interviews from this year was Chris Sims on TV in Australia, going over a lot of the things you said. They're lovely, really like them. Meghan seems really nice. Harry, served in the forces and all that kind of stuff. They're great. But, and then the Australian commentator just started laughing because there's a typical Canadian being super nice and polite and then saying, we're not covering your bills. That's how it's going to go. So,
well,
anyway.
We were getting big coverage in the UK too. Like Aaron Woodrick was all over the papers in the UK, which that's our, obviously our federal director, which I was talking to our counterparts in the UK, the UK Taxpayers Alliance, and talking to their CEO. And while now it's even more touchy for them, they cannot talk about the Royals in a negative at all because there's so many people there that are just, so loyal to the royal family. But they were, they told us off the record they were jealous of I guess it's on the record now. I'm talking about it on the podcast, so that they were jealous of the coverage we were able to get on this story because it was like we were on the front page of the newspaper in some of the British tabloids, which gets huge readership. Now, doesn't necessarily do anything for us. Like we're not getting, not like a bunch of UK people were going to sign up to be supporters of our organization because of it. But not that we'd want them either. But it was funny to see just how much international coverage there was on this story that we were involved in.
Yeah, that was a fun story. Another pre-COVID story. Just over a year ago, we hired an investigative journalist, James Wood, first for our organization, starting to dig up more of the waste that we're seeing as shrinking media have trouble keeping track of. One of the first stories he dug up was a story about the Yukon government paying to throw a bunch of gold in a creek as a part of a tourism stunt. When you first heard that story, what went through your head? What were you thinking?
Well, I was impressed that we had a story out of the Yukon because that is like we have people in all the provinces covering almost all the provinces. We don't usually cover the territories that often. I can probably count on one hand the number of stories we've been involved in the territories, and the fact that James was digging up stories in the Yukon, I was very excited for. And then obviously the story was so crazy that I read everything he wrote on it and wanted to see all the documents because it was just so funny. So that one, I mean, obviously, and there's been a lot of stories of cities and provinces trying to drive tourism. And I always find that one, it's funny. And I feel bad for these places because it's like places where I live, like Edmonton. Like Edmonton used to get in trouble all the time. My favorite story from Edmonton's tourism department was they called up random citizens on the phone and offered them a free trip to Edmonton. But it took like 10 phone calls to get someone to agree to this. Like to take the prize. Like this free trip, you can come, we'll take, set you up, take you to one of the big festivals that we have in Edmonton. Has lots of wonderful festivals, but it took like 10 phone calls until someone was finally like, all right, I guess I'll take your free trip to Edmonton. So, I mean, it was embarrassing, and it turned out to be the publicity on that part of the story ended up being worse for Edmonton's image than the the stunt they were trying to enhance the image of Edmonton. Which everyone should come and see because it's an awesome city and there's lots of stuff to do both in the summer and the winter. Anyways, I felt bad for the Yukon a little bit in that they were like trying something unique, but these things always backfire. Like they always, when you do something that's like too cute or just plain stupid, like buying gold to throw it in a river, someone had to have, I don't know, maybe, I guess obviously not, but you would think that someone would have just would have said to their boss, like, okay, boss, let me see if I got this straight. We're gonna buy a bunch of gold, check, and then we're gonna throw it in the river. People may not be down with that, and that should have been like the end of the conversation. Instead, it was like, no, like we'll crowdfund it. And when they didn't even come close to meeting their goal of the amount of gold they wanted to buy, they bought a little bit of gold and threw it in the river. And then the funnier part of the story was they hired all those influencers, and I love that. I mean, this is such a 2020 story of influencers being flown up to Yukon to like Instagram story, all this stuff, and they got like nothing. Like looking at the comparative stats from these influencers feeds, they got very little. I mean, and I'm not an influencer, so I mean, I cannot say that I could have done it better than them. But like most of the stories didn't even involve gold. Like it was like, yeah, I've been brought up to look at this gold thing, but instead, like, here's some just cool shots of Yukon because this gold thing's kind of dumb. So, yeah, it was a funny story. And James, and on a more serious note of that, I mean, I was just really happy that we were able to get our investigative journalist off the ground running. It was this has been something we've talked about for a few years. And I mean, I can't take the credit in coming up with the idea. This has been pitched by one director or another on staff for probably the last 4 or 5 years. We just finally pulled the trigger on it this last year. And part of it has just been watching the media landscape change and watching the number of investigative journalists in the country disappear, and talking to some of the people who teach investigative journalism at these colleges and schools. I mean, they're lamenting the art of investigative journalism because there's just no one left to do it, and all the old guys who do it are retiring, and they're not being replaced because it's an expensive thing to do. And you know, we couldn't do it if we were trying to do this on a commercial basis. If we were trying to put it in a newspaper with one investigative journalist, I don't think we could make a go of it. But because we've got so many great supporters out there who see value in the work we do, we're able to fund this and able to dig up I mean, over 20 exclusive, never heard before stories, never would have been told before stories on government waste. And to be clear, we're focused on that. And that's, I think, really key to the work that James is doing. Is we said to him, you know, we don't want you hanging out around the press gallery writing the same story that everyone else is writing. We want you far away from the press gallery, digging up and, you know, waste stories, government waste. You could have a great other story about something going on, but if it doesn't involve government waste, hand it off to somebody who you know and get back to the work on government waste, because that's what our supporters care about, and that's what we're paying you to do. And he's done a fantastic job. Couldn't be happier.
And the good thing is, one of the to put a closing note on the Yukon story, we gave it the Teddy Waste Award that year, it was fun to give a Teddy Waste Award to a issue that we found, which was super fun. Obviously, every year we have an awards show where we give out the Teddies for the dumbest government waste every year. But right after the Waste Awards, that's when COVID hit. And it's always weird to tell somebody when you were talking behind their back. But I remember when it was first happening, Mel Harvey, our VP of Finance, and I were talking. She's like, man, Hennig's losing his mind. This thing's getting crazy, and he's losing his mind. And I remember being like, that's nuts. It'll be 2 weeks. We'll be back at it. It's no big deal. Of course, Mel and I turned out to be very wrong. And within days, we were losing our minds too. It was a low time when this stuff first hit. There's a lot of uncertainty. How low did your low moments get on it?
Well, actually, not that bad. I think Mel probably Mel's want to exaggerate it, I think. But no, I mean, look, it changed some of our operations. Obviously, hammered a lot of our supporters. We've got got hundreds of thousands of supporters. We had over 30,000 donations. 30,000 donations come in last year. A lot of those people are small business owners, farmers, people who are entrepreneurs, who are professionals, all kinds of walks of life we have for our supporters. But we could definitely tell that the subset of our support group who donate to us every year and have for 30 years, small business people who are getting decimated. And, I feel bad feeling bad sounds like it's not even a strong enough way of putting it. Like I feel crushed for the people whose small businesses, who they've worked their entire lives for and have not done anything wrong, have had this just swept out from underneath them in many cases. I mean, a lot of them were able to pivot and try new things. And, there's been a lot of innovation this year on our end too. And everyone has had to try to innovate. And that's we can look at any positives from any of this, but the big, huge negatives are that this has been, the biggest drop in the economy in 100 years. I mean, this has been huge and devastating, and it's been propped up. The economy's been propped up by printed money. And when that ends, I mean, we're not out of this. Even when COVID ends, there's going to be a second shoe to drop, and that's the end to all the printed money flowing into the economy and what that's going to do. I mean, I think there's a lot of small businesses that have been able to get through to today, but even when COVID's over, their future is very bleak. And I feel horrible for those people. And I think looking at looking at where our support comes from, and thinking about those people, about what's happening in their own lives. Yeah, it was pretty sad. I mean, and also for the work that we do, we work on public policy. Well, for a month there, like in March through April, almost all of that, the only discussion of public policy was COVID. It was health, and that's it. So nobody talked about anything else that was happening. So, it was weird time for us too, in that we're used to being busy. Like every one of our directors is doing, writing op-eds and doing TV interviews and talking about public policy, and we've got plans and agendas and goals and tactics, and we're out trying to move the ball forward on a lot of issues, and everything stopped except for COVID. And all the work that we had done to, in a lot of cases, move forward on things like balanced budgets in some provinces, like Manitoba is a good example, but even other ones where we had been clawing away since 2008-9 to get governments back towards a balance. We were seeing some success, all of it destroyed in one fell swoop. So some of that was pretty demoralizing, but also trying to figure out like what's this going to look like on the other end, and what do we need to work on? Well, you can always look back to what happened in 2008-9, when we had our last sort of financial crisis, or what happened in, the 80s or whatnot. This isn't like any of those, in that sense, that if this was like a 1 year long recession and governments were borrowing some money, well, we just did that 10 years ago. We would have a pretty good idea of what the other end looked like. Back in March, April, we had no idea what the other end of this was going to look like. And that's a little, I guess it's a little discombobulating, in that you're trying to figure out, like, let's make some plans, and it's almost anyone's guess as to what the world's going to look like and what issues you're going to want to work on. And unless you're working on COVID issues, this was for, we're not alone in this. We were one of many groups who were trying to feel our way through, and we're not healthcare experts, so digging into what kind of PPE people should be having and whatnot was really not our bag. That said, I mean, I think that we were able to kind of get into that issue and start feeling our way out when James wrote the story about the tariff on the masks and gloves.
Yeah, actually, that's exactly where I was going next. I remember at that time, I mean, we almost didn't want to interrupt a lot of the conversation that's happening around the country, because the health was the first issue that people needed to talk about. So we didn't want to go out and do some crazy stunt and try to draw attention away from that. We couldn't have anyway. I remember spending an awful lot of time walking my dog and reading books about podcasts is really what I was doing there for a while. And everybody was trying to use that time to figure out new things. But James stumbled into that story about tariffs on PPE, personal protective equipment. 18% Ottawa was charging on imports of that equipment. Everybody was desperately, I remember construction companies donating masks to hospitals so that they could get through that. We find out that there's an 18% tariff, blow the whistle on that. I don't know, it was like, what, a week or two later, the finance minister comes out and he's like, yeah, that tariff, never mind that, we're taking that off. David Aiken, a prominent reporter in Ottawa, puts out a tweet saying, hey, thanks Taxpayers Federation, you're saving everybody a bunch of money on PPE. What sticks out in your mind about that story? How did you feel about that?
Well, that one was interesting because I got the original email on it from the mayor of Langford, and he just CC'd me on an email, and I was like, "What is it? Langford, BC?" And actually, the weird thing about that was that our former boss, Troy Lanigan, who used to be CEO here, he lives in Langford. Like this is where he lived. Of all like the 3,600 municipalities there are in the country, it was weird. And I get a lot of emails, a lot of CCs on things that I don't look at or I don't read thoroughly. But this one came up from the mayor of Langford. I was like, Mayor of Langford? Oh, that's where Troy lives. Like, I wonder what this is about. And read the thing and forwarded to James, and didn't really think much more about it. I was like, that's really interesting, but I don't know, much. I don't know much about this, and I don't know. And I'll be interested to see if anything comes out of it. And then I didn't hear anything. And then James published the story, and he had really dug into it and found out more information and really gave it some legs, which I thought was very cool. And the fact that it got turned around, I mean, it was a common sense thing for the finance minister to do. So I'm not shocked that he did it. But I guess I'm shocked that nobody before, the mayor of Langford, and no one before us pushing this had sort of jumped on this. Like this, you'd think that like every department in government when this pandemic broke would have been like, okay, what can we do today to make things better? And you would have thought that the crew in terms of in charge of tariffs would have gone out and said, oh, like here's something we can do right away that would make things much better. Like that should have been. But I mean, I think that this is sort of like the tax code in that even the CRA doesn't know what's in it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like the amount of tariffs we have on imported goods is so like it's so obscene that nobody knows what's on these things anymore. Like, and you know, you talk to some of these people who have to import these goods, and they'll tell you that the rules don't make sense. Like, not even just PPE, but like almost anything that you bring in, there's probably like 3 or 4 different competing rules that you have to try to maneuver, and governments are just so big and slow moving that they just never get fixed unless you have some sort of big crisis. Then a group like ours blowing the whistle. So yeah, I was really pleased. I was happy, and I said to James too when I called him after. I said, "Look, you should be personally very proud of the fact that you just saved a pile of money from people who were buying like essential protective equipment." So I don't put too fine of a point on it, but like there's probably some company out there that was going to buy cheaper ones or was not going to be able to afford it, that now can afford better protective equipment for their staff, and you might have saved some lives. Like, I mean, maybe that's overstating it, but I don't know. But I think he should be awfully proud of the fact that he was able to make that kind of impact in the midst of a pandemic.
All right, let's stop talking about COVID for a few minutes. I feel like it's all we're ever going to talk about forever. But you know, let's move on a little bit. So, carbon taxes. We've been fighting carbon taxes forever. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation was the only non-government organization fighting against carbon taxes in every single court challenge that came up. We won in Alberta. The Alberta Court of Appeal ruled that the federal carbon tax is unconstitutional. And then we got to go on to make our arguments at the Supreme Court. How have you been feeling throughout this? How did you feel about our odds at the beginning? How are you feeling about them now? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I always like that because I'm not a lawyer, and the first thing I always ask a lawyer is, "What do you think our chances are?" And the lawyers go, "Oh well, I think that you've got this good argument and that good." They'll never ever put a number on things. They won't give you a percentage. They won't give you odds. Which is, I get it. Like I get that when you can't control the outcome of these things, and you don't know, there's a lot of unknown factors. But anyways, it drives me crazy that lawyers will never give me that answer. But I asked that question. Despite the fact that they don't want to give me an answer, I ask it every time we get into a court case. What's our odds? And our lawyer, who's excellent, Bruce Halder, out of Victoria, BC, I asked him this question before we got into the Saskatchewan one. And he said, I don't know, like 30 to 50%, like, I don't know, somewhere in there. And we lost in Saskatchewan, but it was close. It was 3-2. And then I asked him the same question in Ontario, and he said, probably not as good as Saskatchewan. And we lost that one 4-1. And then it came to the Alberta one, and I asked him before we went in, and he said, yeah, about the same as the other ones, like 30 to 50%. And after he was done, after he'd sat there through all the hearings in Alberta, I asked him again. He said 60 to 75%, basically, like that. Our numbers had jumped. He felt very confident about Alberta. He had a good read on it. And he stayed there through all of it. And the interesting thing about these court cases is you have all these interveners, and there's us on the no carbon tax side, and there's like 30 groups on the pro carbon tax side. And some of them even get together and pool their resources and have one lawyer go in. But the one thing that he regularly pointed out to us was that they weren't making, a lot of these groups, and not all of them, but a lot of these groups weren't making substantial legal arguments in front of these judges. They were there to make a political statement that they were against climate change, and they were, and that was not what the thing. This isn't about whether we're pro or con climate change. That's like it's not even something I think you can be pro or con on. The question is that whether or not these carbon taxes were constitutional or not. And we made arguments, our lawyers made arguments showing that they were not constitutional. And a lot of the groups on the other side didn't bother even to have that conversation. They used their 5 minutes to grandstand. and it's not a good. Judges don't like that, and we wouldn't do that. I mean, look, we've had lots of opportunities to get into other court cases, but we just didn't think we had a legal argument to make in those court cases. And I'm not going to waste our donors' money to go in and we can grandstand outside of the courts for free instead of paying expensive lawyers to go in the courts and grandstand for us. It's not going to help us. We need to have substantial legal arguments if we're going to go into a court case, and we did. And we won that one 4-1. So, the interesting thing was going to the Supreme Court. We knew from day one this was going to go to the Supreme Court. There was no question about that. When I asked Bruce what our chances were there, he wouldn't really give me a good answer. But again, we were sort of sitting around the 30. We thought around 30%, which frankly was good enough for me to get in the fight. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. We will take every shot we can to kill the carbon tax. Now, it may not be a slam dunk. It may be a long shot, but we're going to take it. We're going to take the long shot, because if we didn't take the long shot on this one, nobody else was going to do it. There was nobody else there on the NGO side fighting the carbon taxes. There was 30 groups there on the NGO side fighting for a carbon tax. So if we don't show up, it's 30-0. At least when we show up, it's 30-1. And we're making substantial legal arguments, which I think bolsters our side quite a bit more. So do I think we'll win at the Supreme Court? So the Supreme Court's already done. We went to that. We presented in September. It got pushed from March all the way to September. And it was done mostly virtually, although we sent Bruce right to Ottawa to the Supreme Court to present in person, because we thought that would give us just the slightest better edge at convincing the judges. I don't know if we're going to win or not, but I think it's a lot closer to 50-50 than it was when we started. And he even said that after the Alberta case, because the Saskatchewan and Ontario cases, again, I'm not a lawyer, were substantially the same arguments, substantially the same decision. The Alberta courts were on a very different argument and a very different decision. And so instead of kind of going in thinking about this like it's 2-1, it's actually kind of 1-1, and in some cases, in the view of our lawyer, the arguments in Alberta were even more novel and more substantial than the arguments in the other two cases. So he felt the Alberta case was actually going to be the big swaying point in whether or not we were going to win the Supreme Court. So I'm not going to make any predictions, but I do think that we're going to be closer to 50-50 on whether we're going to win this at the Supreme Court.
Trudeau raised the carbon tax right in the middle of the pandemic. And after that, he came out and said they're going to continue raising the carbon tax right up to 3030. It'll be about 40 cents per liter of gasoline at that point. How surprised were you?
Well, okay, so first they raised it April 1st, which was the planned raise from $20 to $30 per ton. I guess I was surprised at that one, because that one was at the very beginning of the pandemic, and every other country basically canceled any planned increases to the carbon tax. I think we dug into this, didn't we, Todd, and find out that like Canada was the only country that raised their carbon taxes?
At that time, we were it. That was it. Everybody else, even BC's premier, NDP premier, he hit the brakes on the carbon tax at that point.
Yeah, like that one surprised me, because that just seemed like dumb politics. Now, am I surprised that Justin Trudeau thinks that the carbon tax needs to be substantially higher? No, I'm not surprised. I mean, this is his mantra. I mean, and to a certain extent, he's not wrong. Now, let me just explain that before I see your eyes pop out of your head. One of the problems with the carbon tax, other than the fact that it's only implemented in Canada, and Canada is such a small amount of world emissions that even if we eliminate every single emission in Canada, we can't make a lick of difference in global climate change, is that raising your gasoline bill by 20 or 30 cents a liter, I mean, is that enough for you to stop driving? No. And so if it's not enough for you to stop driving, and raising it by, raising your monthly heating bill for your house by $30 or $50, is that enough for you to stop heating your house? Well, of course not. So that's not, if economists will tell you that you need to have a tax at a level that's actually going to change behavior. Now, I think it's stupid, and even if we did raise it to $1 million a ton and convinced everyone to impoverish themselves so that we could get to a zero emissions in Canada, we'd still make no difference in the world in terms of global climate change, because we're less than 2% of world emissions. Like, to me, it's like your buddy calls you up and says, "Hey, I need you to help me move my piano from my living room down to my basement." And he calls like 6 guys, and we all agree to come over. And then on the day of, we're like, actually, I'm going to watch football instead. I'm not going to go. And then our buddy, instead of saying like, okay, well, can we reschedule, or I guess I'll just watch football instead as well. He like pushes against the piano for like 12 hard hours, busting his back, moving it nowhere. Like that would seem insane to you, that if someone said, oh yeah, my buddy like spent 12 hours pushing this piano and got nowhere all day. Yeah, his back's completely injured. He's laid out. Like, oh, he's a mess now. Like, can't walk. You'd say, what an idiot. Like, what was this guy thinking? He should have called some friends up. Well, he did. They didn't show up. Oh, well, then he should not have been pushing on the piano. That's what this would be. Like, we raise our carbon tax to $1 million, and we all push on. We all ruin our economy. We all, have a bunch of job losses, all this stuff for nothing, for absolutely no benefit. It's not like we have unclean air or water. We have some of the cleanest air and cleanest water in the entire world in this country. This isn't China. We're not, there's no smog days that we're having to worry about in this country. So there's really minuscule, if any, benefit to doing this. So it doesn't shock me that he believes that we actually have to raise the carbon tax a lot to get people to move on it. What surprises me is that he's doing it in the middle of a pandemic when the economy is already at the lowest point it's been in 100 years. And also the fact that he doesn't seem to get the second part of this. He gets the first part, that you're going to have a punishing carbon tax if you want people to, to change their behavior in terms of driving and heating their home. But he's missed the second half of it, that this ain't going to make any lick of difference for climate change anyways.
Sounds to me like we may be fighting this for a while. Sounds like you're not going to let directors off the hook not fighting this one. Seems like something we're going to continue to push.
When we poll our supporters on this, it's still number one issue, because our supporters get what Trudeau doesn't, that this is a pointless exercise that's very expensive and is going to just punish people. I mean, I was having this conversation with a guy the other day that, like, I think that Trudeau actually thinks that it's like a choice for most families to either buy like a Chevy minivan or a Tesla. Like that's a rational choice for people. Like, oh, I don't know why they don't buy a Tesla. Like, they're only, like 10 times the cost of that used van that you were going to buy instead. Like, I don't know. That seems to me like a rational thing. I don't know if he just doesn't get that, or like, oh yeah, we're all just going to rip out our natural gas furnaces in our houses and just put like, geothermal in our backyards. Like, this is, that's just a regular choice that families can make right now. No, like, you drive around like wealthy neighborhoods and you'll see solar panels. You drive around not wealthy neighborhoods, you ain't seeing a solar panel anywhere. You might be hard pressed to find a solar powered calculator in those neighborhoods. So I think that they're just out to lunch when it comes to what Canadians can. And I mean, look, we would all drive Teslas if they were cheaper and, our gas bill was low. I mean, this isn't like a simple choice for families. This would mean like sacrificing a lot to make choices that really at the end of the day aren't going to be worth a hill of beans. So I'm sorry, I'm beating a dead horse, but we're definitely not laying off on this one.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of fight left. A lot of people, it's funny, just in the political circuit for a while, a lot of pro carbon tax people were kind of crowing that the fight was over, that it was there's nothing you could do to fight it. And I was like, you need to go walk down Main Street. This fight is nowhere close to over, and we got a lot of fight left. So we'll continue on that. But I want to move to an issue is actually really sparked by a terrible tragedy. In Nova Scotia, 22 people were murdered by a gunman, and the Trudeau government announced afterward that it would ban and confiscate thousands of guns. We took our time thinking about this one. We didn't react to it immediately. We spent a few days working through this. But we came out, we're opposing it. We're going to court to fight this policy. We talked about this one quite a bit. What tipped it in your mind? What made the difference and made you feel that we needed to oppose this?
100% our supporters. Like, I'm not a gun guy. It's not to say that I, am anti-gun or pro-gun. It's just not a thing. I live in a city. I don't have any varmint in my back 40 that I need to take care of. So it's just not part of what I grew up with. So I can't say that I am in tune with, gun culture. So we asked our supporters. Like, I mean, talking to you're more of a gun guy than I am for sure. So obviously we had a lot of conversations about these things. But for me, it was our supporters. We asked our supporters on this question because like I'd seen some polling in Toronto that suggested that 60% of Torontonians would love to see all guns banned forever. And I was like, oh, wow, like those numbers were surprising to me. We should probably find out where our people are at with this before we jump in, because we got into the gun registry issue, 20 years ago, because we had seen that it was a huge, crazy waste of money. And that one was, I don't think that one was as probably touchy or worrisome for us in terms of something to jump into. That one just was clear cut for us. This one was a little different, but the money is probably going to be the same or worse. And, I had a conversation too with our friend New Zealand, who runs the New Zealand taxpayer group there. And he was also like, you guys need to get on this. Like we've gone through this in New Zealand. I'll tell you, our supporters were all about it. And that plus asking our supporters really convinced me that this was something that needed to be done. After we sort of made that decision, hearing the stories of just how some small businesses like the one in Cassandra Parker's small business up in Prince George, how she was being just crippled by this, and seeing the interview that Chris Sims did with her was really convincing. And then the other thing too that I thought was really convincing was when we saw the actual order in council that made the ban, and just how haphazard. I mean, it seemed to me that they just assigned some intern to Google assault guns, assault weapons, and just write down a list of any other word that came up near it. Like it was some sort of word search game they were doing, because they banned Facebook pages and toy guns, and it was not done in a manner that you would expect out of professionals who actually had put time and effort and thought into crafting public policy that is good for the country. It was clearly done in a knee-jerk, rapid way, which is often, these guys sometimes don't do the best work when they sit and think about things. They're definitely not doing their best work when they're slapping something together on the back of a napkin. And that's what they clearly did. So, that was really what sealed it for me, that this needed to be challenged.
Yeah, I remember looking at it. The thing that really stuck out to me is they're going to spend a ton of money on this, but I don't think it'll make anything safer. I enjoy hunting. I grew up, around guns and hunting and stuff. So it is part of my background. But even me, if you could show that a policy is going to make things safer, I'm going to take a real close look at it. But in this case, hundreds of millions, I think this goes north of $1 billion all in. And I don't think it'll make anything safer. And honestly, I felt nervous when we came out on a side on this. Our supporters were 100% with us. That always makes me feel better. But I still, you feel a little bit nervous. But the RCMP's union came out after us, making most of the same points that we made, saying that this is not a way to make things safer. I was like, yeah, if the folks out there keeping things safe think this doesn't work, probably we're on the right track. So that's going to be a fight that we continue to go after. Okay, back to more typical ground for us. The debt is freaking me out. It's $1 trillion. It's freaking me out. It was weird for me the first times I started typing it and editing it into our stuff, our materials. That's an awful lot of money. I didn't think we'd ever get there. How worried are you about that debt?
I also didn't think we'd get there. And it wasn't that I thought our politicians would come to their senses. I just thought that we would be successful in pushing this backwards again. I mean, we saw the debt clock run backwards for 11 years. I mean, it was hundreds of billions of dollars of our national debt was paid off in the late 90s through the 2000s. And I thought we were going to circle back to that, or at least freeze it around the numbers we were at, the 600 billion mark for a few years. I did not think we were going to get to $1 trillion in I didn't think if it did happen, I thought it was going to take decades for us to maybe creep up to $1 trillion. The fact we got there from 600 to 640 or whatever we were at up to $1 trillion in 1 year is crazy. And I think that there is a lot of the pandemic spending that went on that was necessary. I think when you basically force businesses to shut down against their will and not through any difficulty of their own, you've got to prop them up. And when you tell people they can't go to work, you got to make them, there's got to be some sort of backstop for them. Do I think we went overboard? Yes. And I think that they were been pretty sloppy with the rules, and there, as we're seeing now, there's a bunch of publicly traded companies collecting piles of money that they're then turning around and handing off in bonuses and shareholder dividends. And we're also seeing people who clearly never qualified for CERB, who are being told they have to pay the money back. That's my next worry, honestly, is that people who took piles of money through CERB, who clearly were not qualified, are going to be able to convince the government to let them keep it because they didn't know, and it was a bad time and pandemic and all that sort of stuff. So, the one thing that I thought was really interesting was looking at the IMF. They did a comparison between all of the sort of major nations in the world. Actually, I think every country's on the list, but if you go through their list, Canada, of all the major nations in the world, has gone like the furthest into debt this year than anyone else. Like we're at like 20% of our GDP in terms of this year's deficit. Other countries like Germany are 10% or less. Like lots of major G7, G20 nations have gone half as far as we went into debt this year. So yeah, I mean, I think that they saw there being they saw a fire going on, and they just said, open up as many hoses as we possibly can, and didn't turn them off quick enough, and didn't realize what they were doing at the time. So I'm concerned. Yeah, look, the next question that everyone has is, are we going to see inflation? And in a normal circumstance, with government printing hundreds of billions of dollars, the answer would be clearly yes. Inflation's a hidden form of tax, so we don't want to see inflation, but we also don't want to see governments be allowed to get away with printing billions of dollars and there be no consequence either. And I think this year or the next few years, I don't know if we're going to see that inflation that that would have normally be predicted. And I think that's because everyone in the world is borrowing. We've all devalued our currency, and it's not like we're borrowing and the U.S. isn't. And if you were an American and you had someone in Canada owe you money, you wouldn't take Canadian dollars because it's not worth as much anymore because we're printing so much. Your money's not worth as much either, and we're all sort of equally not worth as much. I guess probably would have been smart to buy gold before this, but I worry that we're not going to see the inflation, and I worry that if we don't see inflation, that's going to be a signal to our politicians that printing money is totally fine and borrow as much as you want. And I just had a conversation with a friend who jokingly said, well, look, if we don't see inflation in 2 years, we should just lobby for there to be all taxes eliminated, because clearly it doesn't matter. And that's scary. I mean, it's joking, but I mean, that's a scary thought to me, that governments could just print money and it doesn't matter. That we may come to that, or we may see politicians who actually believe that and want to move forward with that kind of policy. So yeah, I'm scared. I'm really quite worried for the future here if we don't get back to sort of normal fiscal sanity.
So if you were prime minister, you had a day, you're in there for a day, what's the first thing you do to try to turn that around, get a little bit more sanity there?
Well, I was gonna suggest I change the national anthem to something by Rush. That can't be the.
I don't think it would hurt. It's worth a shot. It's a better idea than most of the ones I'm seeing from Parliament Hill right now. So I'm up for it.
Okay. So if we're changing things, I mean, first thing we have to do is ensure that we're going to have a strong economy coming out of this. And I think a lot of what we wrote in our roadmap to recovery documents, which is it was an open letter to Parliament, and it was also a report that our federal director Aaron Woodrick put out. I think a lot of what's in there is right. Like, we need to scale back this temporary spending as soon as we can. We need to cut taxes. And normally I wouldn't suggest we normally wouldn't suggest cutting taxes at the expense of the deficit, but I would for the next year or two, so that we can ensure that we can keep money in the economy and keep things going, because there is a second shoe to drop. And when it drops, it can either be propped up through, government spending, or it can be propped up through tax reductions. The problem with government spending is they never get it right. I mean, as we saw with the Harper government in the 08-09 era, I mean, they were spending money on infrastructure that a lot of which was not needed. And we were building, canoe museums, for God's sakes. Like, there was stuff that there's, shovel ready stuff isn't always the right stuff. Like, you don't just build something because there's some guy willing to build it. You build stuff because you need it and because it's going to enhance the economy. That's why, you build a road so that we can move goods from point A to point B, not because Jerry needs a job. Like, that's a bad way to do it. And the Harper government did too much of that. I'm worried the Kenney government's going down that road again. They're spending a ton of money on infrastructure that I'm questioning whether it's needed. I mean, people are even talking about now building high-speed rail between Edmonton and Calgary, which high-speed rail doesn't even make sense in heavily populated areas. And Edmonton to Calgary is not a heavily populated area. Anyways, that wasn't your question. Your question was about like getting this back under control. And I would say that we need to cut the taxes, cut the spending, cut as much red tape as we possibly can. I mean, we're doing everything we can to block pipelines in this country, which would actually make a huge economic benefit to most of this country. Eliminate the red tape, try to super boost the economy, make Canada known as a place where business can get done, and where there's as little regulation as we absolutely need, nothing more. I mean, just look at what the work secondstreet.org has been doing on some of the regulations that have been cut during the pandemic. I mean, it took no time for governments to cut a bunch of regulations about being allowed to order a bottle of wine with your takeout meal. Like, why did that take a pandemic to figure out something as simple as that? So, I mean, I think that we need to take a really hard look at what is absolutely necessary and what isn't. And I don't think I could get that done in one day as prime minister. It might take 2 or 3, but that's what I'd work on.
2 or 3. I think that'd be a reasonable amount of time to be there.
As long as I'd ever want to be prime minister too. Like, that's a terrible job.
It looks like a tough job. Yeah. Happily, I don't think anybody's going to give that job to either of us. So probably won't lose too much sleep about it. So listen, we've talked a lot about different campaigns that we work on, the strategies we do, the decision-making process we go through, all of that stuff, all of the stuff that the media sees, that politicians see, and all of that. But I think people, especially in politics and in the media, would be surprised at what it is that really allows us to win victories. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's our army is bigger than their army. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. You can, if you needed like a small regulation changed, hire a lobbyist, like some obscure little regulation. Lobbyists can go in and help you out and that stuff. You want to move mountains. You want to push politicians to make the right decision. You need to have the biggest army out there pushing with you. I mean, look, I like to think that I'm a smart guy. I know you're a smart guy. But I also know that neither of us has ever walked into a politician's office and tried to convince them that we're smarter than them. And it's not that we're politicians or some sort of geniuses. It's that they're not interested. I mean, this is, I don't want to get all theoretical with you, but this is like public choice theory 101. You've got politicians who want to get reelected, and they're going to do whatever they think is going to give them the best chances of reelection. Did Stephen Harper want to, nationalize the auto companies in 2008-9? Probably not. Like, I want to believe, at least in his heart of hearts, that he knew that was intellectually the wrong thing to do. But there's so many votes in Southern Ontario that rely on the auto industry, so they did it. I don't think that these guys make deep calculations about the policy. They make deep calculations about where the people are at. So our vision, or our sort of thoughts on how we're going to win, is we're going to get the biggest number of people who are upset with an issue or in favor of an issue to contact their politicians and push them. And we're going to go and convince Canadians. We're not going to convince the politicians, because politicians are a lost cause. We're going to convince Canadians that they need to be on side on this issue, and they need to take action. And we're gonna send them marching into battle to push these politicians. I mean, I look back at the carbon tax, is a great example of this. when we were in 2015 and every province was implementing a carbon tax, the federal government was implementing a carbon tax, the polling numbers were like 50-55% of people were opposed to a carbon tax. And I think I said this at the time, and I knew that if we get those numbers up to 60-65% opposed to a carbon tax, we would start to see movement. And we did in Alberta, we did in Saskatchewan, we did Saskatchewan primarily, both those provinces probably more like 80%. But we saw that in Ontario. I mean, I don't know if Doug Ford or any of the PC leadership candidates in that last PC leadership race had strong feelings on a carbon tax. They just knew that the majority of Ontarians were not happy with the size of their electricity bills and all of their energy bills in that province, and the carbon tax was one of the culprits. It's not rocket science. You get 60-65% of the people on side, you're going to win every time.
And that's why our supporters are so important. And this is why we email them and all of that kind of thing, because we can't push this on our own. That's not what it's about. It's about making sure that we're all pushing at the right time together on the right thing. And it makes a huge difference. All right, I'm going to finish off with one kind of silly, funny question. Some of our past presidents, like Troy Lanigan, Ken Asenparty, super smart, very effective, but they're a bit crazy. Like, they are characters. Like, let's just be honest about that. These everybody who knows these fellas knows some funny stories about those fellas. What is some of the funniest advice that they've given you about taking over as president?
Oh boy. Well, I mean, I actually think that Ken gave me some really interesting advice. Ken's also a board member now, and he said to me that when you become the boss, it gets really lonely, because when you go and ask people for their advice, they're gonna also think about what you want to hear, and not necessarily what may be the best advice. And I always sort of found that when I worked with Troy previously, was that it was important for someone to play devil's advocate with him sometimes, and that's the role that you often get to play with me, and lots of our employees do. At least I hope they're playing devil's advocate. No, kidding. But the thing that he said was, you've got to make tough decisions, and you've got to stand by them. And look, I think that I think that's been an important secret to our success over 30 years here, is that we treat this not as some sort of hobby. This isn't some sort of hobby that we're all just getting together and playing pinochle on a Friday night for fun. This is serious, and we're a serious organization that has been entrusted with the support of people who work very hard to earn that money and give it to us voluntarily. We don't take it from anyone. We don't take it from anyone off their paychecks automatically because we've somehow got a law that allows us to, and we never would. And so, I think that some of the advice that I got that has been very useful is to think about that farmer in Three Hills, Alberta, or in Humboldt County or wherever, that has reached into their wallet and entrusted us to go out and fight for them and with them and do our darndest. And if we wake up every day and think about that and do that, then we'll be successful. And we're not here for fun and games. We're here to push the ball. And if we don't, then someone else will for us. So yeah, that's the advice I got from both those guys. And everyone's got their own unique quirks. I'm sure I do too, but I'm thankful those two guys got us to where we are today, and hopefully we can continue to move it forward and get to the next level.
All right. That's all the questions I've got for you today. Thanks so much for chatting with me, for all of you listening. Thanks for hanging in. We're going to come back with some more of our typical podcasts coming forward. We got lots of crazy stuff cooking. James Wood's got more crazy stories of waste cooking. We've got big policy initiatives coming. So we'll talk about those soon, but thank you so much for your support, and thanks for listening.